lot of people. I have 2 small boys. I'm active at Ray School. I like being at a neighborhood school, and it feels like it's a good place to try to strengthen our community.
Excellent. So Hyde Park, good neighborhood schools. One more.
And I love it because it's quiet. I can walk my son to school, and I think the school community really is one of the reasons I love it the most. We built a really great familial community around building that school up and helping it to become what it has become. Most of the relationships we have with other people in that neighborhood are all revolving around that school. So being able to walk my son home from school is just one of the best moments.
So Beverly, good neighborhood school, it's quiet, and there's a community around that school. How many of you moved into the neighborhood because you had a good school nearby? You wanted, a quality school was a decision in where you decided to live. For how many of you was it access to transportation, public transportation? What about parks? Did anyone feel led to live near a park? Okay. Is there anyone here who feels that, I don't really mind if my child has to dodge bullets on the way to school? No? Anyone saying, well, we don't really need grocery stores nearby. I'm okay not having access to a grocery store. How about transportation? You'll just walk everywhere. Did anyone say that? I'll just walk. The fundamental underlying premise is that we all want the same things. That no matter the race, or the socioeconomic status, or the gender, we all want the same things. That the things that make us similar are much greater than the things that supposedly divide us. The issue is that our public policy is not based on that fundamental premise. And so we have these issues of equity, which is really the notion that there are some groups for whom it is okay that they don't have neighborhood schools, schools that they can walk to, schools that they can build strong communities around. For some groups, it's acceptable that they have 50 homicides in a year in their community. For some groups, it is okay that the nearest grocery store is a couple of miles away, and they should just make do with corner stores filled with food that will be harmful for children. This is our public policy. This is the premise upon which we have built public policy. This issue of equity, it is not based on a notion that some groups or some individuals are inherently deficient. So even in the illustration that is very popular with the apple boxes, there's nothing inherently wrong with the different heights of the individuals, or the fact that one actually needs a couple of boxes more than the other. The issue is that our public policy values people differently. And so this issue of integration and equity is a question of value. And the reason why I say it's a question of value is because when groups are valued differently by the power structure, the resources that are allocated are different. And so you do not get the kind of investment that you see in areas where the individuals and families in that particular area are valued. Segregation and inequity are intentional. They don't just happen by happenstance. These are public policies that drive inequity. Things that were named earlier: redlining, the lack of access to capital, housing segregation. These were policies that were actually put forth by our government, by our leadership, that fostered the inequitable circumstances that we find ourselves in today. And so this notion that it sort of happens in this laissez-faire way, where just Somehow people all decided to live around each other and just decided that they wanted to live in communities that were less safe or had less access to schools or less access to parks and green space. We have to push back against that notion so we understand where to put our focus if we're going to change an inequitable system, and in this case, inequitable systems. And so the remedy, and this isn't talked about perhaps enough, it's not necessarily integration for integration's sake. The remedy is to address the inequitable resource allocation and investment because we have a power structure that says that some groups of people aren't deserving or as deserving as others. And that brings us to a very difficult point. And the best illustration that I can give as to why the remedy is not just integration for integration's sake is because we've seen over the last 60 years of public policy where the solution was vouchers, where the few lucky ones got a voucher and they could move to a predominantly white community to get access to all the things that we all want. Or busing. After Brown v. Board, the mechanism to integrate schools was to bus students from one side of the city to another, to a school that had the resources that we all want. And what do we find today? We find that our communities are still as segregated as they were, in some cases more so. We find that in our schools, they're actually more segregated than 60 years ago. Whereas a remedy would have been to invest in the schools, even that were predominantly black. Because the problem wasn't necessarily black people being all together. The problem was those schools lacked books, they lacked access to whatever technology, they lacked the ability to pay teachers sufficiently. But our solution was to bus them elsewhere. A short-term fix, but not a long-term solution. And so where does that leave us today? In some school districts, you see as a matter of policy, they're actually carving out their own school districts. So those who are valued by the power structure, if you go down to Gardendale, Alabama, in a predominantly, I think it's a predominantly black Jefferson County, where white families have actually carved out a separate school district from the existing one to exclude people of color in that county. This is happening in 2017. It's happening around the country. And so how do we address the issue of value? One is by changing the premise of the conversation. At NTA, for example, a high-performing, predominantly black school, it didn't matter that the school was high-performing. If the people weren't valued, if those who have access to political power and resources can influence decision makers to get what they want at the expense of those who are here, this is why we have to speak up. Whether you have children here or not, if we say that the underlying premise is that we all want the same things, then we should see ourselves in each other. And it means that we direct our activism to those in power. It means that we force a different conversation that does not allow them to get off of the hook, as Marissa was saying. We cannot let them off the hook with the excuses that they'll put forth about why they're okay doing less for those who are entitled to more, not just by virtue of who they are, but because our public policy has disadvantaged groups for decades. That should undergird all of the work that we do. This flows through process as well, and this is where what happened at Ogden and Jenner was so important. And it's different from how things have played out at NTA. One of the things that started at Ogden and Jenner was conversations. And anyone who was there knows that there were some difficult conversations. There were some community meetings where we talked about things that people would be afraid to talk about in a public setting, where issues of race, of class, stereotypes, fear of the other, we had to grapple with those. At times it felt that the kids were just a byproduct of this other narrative. about who's valued and who's not. But what they did is they kept having the conversation. And it was one about what merging these two schools would look like. Not a takeover, not an absorption, but honoring the fact that these are two distinct communities with distinct cultures. But the underlying premise, we all want the same things. We want a high-quality school for our children. And the process has taken quite some time, but such is the nature of that kind of work. At NTA, the opportunity for that kind of dialogue did not happen because you have a school district that values people differently, that believes that the kids who are high-performing here can be dispersed to the winds so that they can implement the plans of a more valued group. And we have to push back against that narrative. And we have to push back against those policymakers at every turn. They have to be very uncomfortable. And the way that we do that is by speaking candidly about the fact that, hey, the issue is not that you want to integrate, the issue is that one group is more valuable than the other to you. And see how they respond. And I think moving forward, it's going to require us to continue to have these kinds of conversations. Difficult conversations, challenging conversations, but conversations that are necessary if we're going to address this issue of inequity and help usher in the policies that will create equity. Because by virtue of adjusting those policies, integration will happen automatically. Because what, at the end of the day? Precisely.
I know you have questions after that. We do have time for 1 to 2 questions, so think about what you want to ask.
So only one thing I can disagree with, I don't disagree is the right word, but I don't see it as public policy, but a public practice. Because the law says different things, and the people in government are not following the law, nor the judges or anybody else. And we need to have, when the person has a problem, they get a lot of drugs made, but if the person's not following it, we're going to stay in the same places one time.
I agree. It's law, it's practice, it's de facto, it's de jure. Either way, inequitable policies are intentional. I can't see. Sure.
So, same question as before. So the Ogden and Jenner example is actually a really great one. Like how did the parents at Ogden, like how were their actions intentional, and like how did Ogden and Jenner do integration right rather than like a disruptive force? Can you talk more about that?
It starts by acknowledging that there are two distinct communities on the same plane. That one may be better resourced, one may have a different population that is of higher socioeconomic status, but they're on the same level, there's parity there. So we had to be very intentional from the beginning about stating that this isn't Ogden taking over Jenner. This is two schools who are of equal value and should have a say in what this merger looks like, right? So they had to be very clear about that from the very beginning. The way that the parents responded, I think part of it was to be expected. You had a lot of stereotypes that we had to deal with. There were a lot of fears, many of them not based in any kind of educational research or evidence-based practice, but understanding the society that we're in, those stereotypes had to be dealt with. And that was the series of difficult community conversations that took place over the course of the last, I guess it's been 2 years now. And it doesn't mean that it's all resolved either. Many of the parents, some parents may not want their kids to be in that school, right? If the merger occurs. That's a hallmark of segregation, where if you're valued, you have the ability to take your kids out of the school system. That's white flight, that's carving out school districts, that's going to happen. but the fact that the leadership in the schools was committed to having those difficult conversations and being candid and establishing that they are on par was very important to making sure that it is a merging of cultures and not just one school taking over or absorbing the other.
About having these difficult conversations as a Black woman with speaking with people who are not Black and not come off as offensive, those people, right? Not come off as intimidating, because you want people to give you honest responses without feeling like, oh, she's gonna, look at me crazy if I say this. You want to have that honest, environment. How do you get there to where it's not, oh, she's attacking me, how do you have that conversation?
So the question is how to have those difficult conversations in a way where where people don't feel attacked or intimidated or kind of shut down. And for me, I think it's important to be authentic and genuine. You lay the groundwork. What is our goal? Why are we here? The goal is to we wanted to address two issues in the school. One is overcrowding, one is undercrowding. You don't shy away from the issues that are on the table. It has to be authentic. If we operate from good faith, meaning that we're all at the table because we see this bigger problem and we want to be a part of the solution, then that in and of itself creates a space where you can engage authentically. For me, there's no value in sitting around a table with different people with different perspectives if you're going to shut yourself down, or if you feel that you have to muzzle yourself, or if you feel uncomfortable sharing something. It's also important to have a good facilitator, someone who can facilitate and help take people through the rough patches, right? But in any of these kinds of settings, good faith, recognizing that we're operating in good faith, having a clear agenda and a clear goal, that we're all here because whatever that agenda is. And then being respectful, the things that we, if you're a teacher, you set the tone. That helped.
That was a great question, and I'm gonna follow up on that in a moment, but we're gonna give Amara one more round of applause.